Waldy and Bendy.
Hello and welcome to the podcast They Could Not Stop, Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art. I'm Waldemar Nuszczak, the art critic of the Sunday Times here in London, and I'm joined in Scotland by Dr. Bendor Grosvenor. Now, he's the author of The Invention of British Art, a radical reinterpretation of art's British history. But he's also been a dealer, a critic, a TV personality, all sorts of things. So it's no wonder they call him the Rabbi Burns of art history. Bendor, did you have a good Burns night this year?
We had a lovely Burns night. It was more than a month ago, Wild. We're lagging behind, but yes, our Burns night was lovely. It was a very special Burns night this year because I was recently involved in the rediscovery of a lost portrait of Robbie Burns. Did you know about this?
I did. In fact, I have just fed you this opening so you can tell us all about it. And while you're at it, a little bit more about Burns Night, because I think many of our listeners in Calgary, in Canada, in Alaska, in Florida, the ones we've all got in Australia, and of course in our big American stronghold of Ohio, they may not know about what Burns Night is. I know you Scots people, you celebrate it crazily every year, don't you?
Yeah, Robbie Burns Night is big in America, particularly in Ohio. But this is the night every year where in Scotland we celebrate the wonderful poems of Robbie Burns. He wrote, for example, things like Auld Lang Syne and all that stuff. And it involves a haggis, and you have to stand up and say the ode to the haggis and then stab it with your knife. And the more tartan you can wear and the more whiskey you can drink, the better. But this year, very exciting for us because a friend of mine, a collector who lives in Edinburgh, American himself actually, called Dr. Bill Zacks, he and I worked together on a portrait of Robbie Burns by the greatest Scottish artist who ever lived, I think, probably, Sir Henry Raeburn, which had been missing for 200 years until it surfaced last year at an auction just outside London. Dr. Bill Zacks bought it, and I was on hand to help him for some of the work. So that if any listeners are in Edinburgh or heading towards Edinburgh this year, they can see this portrait. It's now gone on display in the National Galleries of Scotland. I have to say, he's looking very bonny.
Wow. So, Bendy, this is a kind of sleeper, was it, that you helped to find, which, of course, is your great contribution to art history. You find these lost masterpieces.
Every now and then I get lucky, or I help someone who is also getting lucky. So this was a case of that process, yes.
Excellent. Well, I've been to a few Burns nights in my time, and my wife is Japanese, right? And we've been to a couple where we've had to learn some Robbie Burns poems, and we kind of do a double act where she does a bit and I do a bit, and let's just say her Scottish accent is even worse than mine, and mine's pretty bad. So when you recite,
give us a bit.
Well, we willie brew the peck of malt and a Rab and Allen come to tea. That's something like that, anyway.
Oh, yes.
I used to know that all the way through. It's horrible. I know it's horrible. No, it goes down well in some depths of Russia, maybe. I apologise for that. Let's move on very, very quickly. So in the second half of the podcast, I think we're going to need a bit of uplifting. So we're going to be looking at that crucial art subject, the bad haircut. Now, art is full of them, of course, so I guess we'll be having a little try to find out which is the worst. So that's coming up later. But first, something darker and more serious and more important, Bendy. I think, as you and I know all too well, the story of art is the story of the world, right? And right now, the world's in a pretty grim place, isn't it? And I'm thinking chiefly, of course, of events in Iran. It's a particularly tragic situation, and in these situations, art, it always suffers. It gets blown up, destroyed, looted. So I thought we should turn our artistic attention to Iran for a moment and delve a tiny bit into the story of its art and its relationship to our own European art, because I think it is one of the great art stories.
Tales of the Art World.
Bendy, I made a film a few years ago, a couple of decades ago now, to be honest with you, where it was about Islamic art. It was called Paradise Found, and it involved me going around the Islamic world looking at Islamic art in its best moments. Mm-hmm. So it's a fantastic subject anyway, because I love Islamic art. But my best moments of all, I think, were spent in Iran. Uh-huh. And I saw things that were so astonishingly beautiful and interesting, absolutely fascinating art, so skillfully made. It knocked me out. And I've been trying really to get back there ever since, and not able to. And then it's quite hard to get visas and things. We might put up a link to a little extract from that film of mine up on the ZCZ website on YouTube. But I wanted to talk about that a bit if I could. And I think you've got some stuff you want to talk about as well with Iran, particularly in its sort of earlier identity as Persia. You want to add some stuff to that, don't you?
Yes, no, unlike you, I have never yet been to Iran. I just thought it'd be nice to hear some of your Iranian art stories. And I've got some from a European perspective. There's a few interesting examples of how the artistic pendulum, how the artistic flow has gone back and forth between Europe and Iran. But when you were there, Wild, with a BBC film crew and a BBC hat on, that feels like an era that couldn't possibly happen anymore. Was it easy getting in, or did they follow you around, or?
Well, I think it was one of those periods when it was easier to get in than usual. So we didn't really have any problems at all, to be honest with you. We didn't have much trouble getting the visas. Obviously, we were saying we're going to be making a film about how great Iranian and Persian art is, which is true. So we had quite a relaxed time. And there's a scene in the film, Bendor, where I'm standing in front of the mausoleum of the Ayatollah Khomeini. So that's the first Ayatollah, the one who launched the Islamic Revolution. And his tomb is just outside, the capital. And I'm there, standing there. I walk in. There's this lovely scene where all these kids gather around me and they're all smiling and laughing. And I walk into the middle of the mosque and I have my little book and I have a little thing to say and I do a piece to camera in front of the tomb of Ayatollah Khomeini. Everybody's smiling around me. And I remember I read a piece of poetry by Omar Khayyam. Do you remember that during the First World War in particular, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which are these Sufi verses full of kind of hope and understanding of the complexities and darkness of life. It's very, very popular amongst British soldiers on the Western Front. And I had a copy of it with me, and I just read a poem about the sort of pointlessness of life. And I finished off with this thing where I read the poem, which ends on this kind of beautiful note of saying, whatever's happening in the world, have a drink and be merry. Drink and it'll help you forget it because the bad times will always pass, or something of that ilk. I'm trying to praise it. And I say in this piece to camera that, presidents, ayatollahs, kings and princes come and go, but art in its beauty will always remain and outlive them. And so, and I watched this little clip again the other day and I thought, my God, that is not only so true, but it's a sort of poignant thing to be thinking about now. So, yes, I had a wonderful time there. I made these pieces to camera in front of the Ayatollah's tomb, and I saw some amazing places. Have you ever heard of a place called Gombad-e Kavus in Iran?
No, afraid not.
Okay, so it's in the far north of Iran. Just before you get to Turkmenistan, just sort of on the edge of the Caspian Sea. And there was a guy there in the early 11th century or late 10th century who was a kind of local warlord, and he was called Abdul Hassan Kavus Ebn Vushmgir. I'm sure I've destroyed the pronunciation there, but Ebn Vushmgir. And he built this thing, Bendor, which honestly astonished me and continues to astonish me. So it's a tower, a brick tower, right? It's over 170 foot tall. And if you saw it, you would say to yourself, that looks like something like a European water tower from the 1930s. It's absolutely made of brick. It's hard-edged minimalism, no decoration on it. We'll obviously put a picture up of it for people who are watching on the YouTube channel. And it sort of goes up into the sky, and it just sticks up there out of the ground like a brick needle. And it's such a futuristic thing. So kind of gorgeous and minimalist, all made out of brick. So, of course, when the sun shines on it in Iran, you see the shadows formed by the flanges on the edge, forming these like zebra stripes of black and brick colour alternating. Just a beautiful, beautiful, modern-looking thing. So I go and see this thing, and guess when it was made?
1350.
1006 it was finished. So before William the Conqueror was born, the Persians, the pre-Persians, were making this thing. in Gombad-e Kavus. Absolutely astonishing. And then you go inside it, and you know what it was? It was a mausoleum to this guy, Abdul Hassan Kavus ibn Vashbagir. And he decided to have himself buried, right? It's 170-foot tall construction, suspended from the roof in this coffin made of rock crystal. So a rock crystal coffin hanging down from the roof. And every day when the sun hit the right place in the roof, this shaft of sunlight would penetrate the darkness, hit him and illuminate the coffin. So it's not there anymore, by the way, the coffin. The coffin disappeared some time ago. But the memories of it continue. And I just thought, what a miraculous, what a wonderful place. It was pretty much the first thing I saw in Iran. I've been wanting to see it for a while because I love Islamic architecture. And it just absolutely astonished me. And then the rest of the journey, it just got better and better. Have you been to Isfahan?
No, I haven't. But you know what? You're giving me ideas for a mausoleum. Do you ever think about mausoleums and tombs for yourself? Because I have to confess, it's something I think about quite a lot, much to my wife's frustration. And the idea of hanging in a rock crystal tomb that will illuminate me at a certain time of the day, I find that quite inspirational.
Okay. Yes, it is very you, isn't it? There's a little inscription of a Rabbi Burns poem on the side. Yeah. Do you know what? I mean, you're significantly younger than me, right? I'm a really old boy, so yes, I have thought about it. There was a time, I don't know, a few years ago, I thought of starting up a company, right? We were going to be dealing in tombstones. And I thought what I would do, right, is I would get famous artists like Grayson Perry, and Tracy Emin, Damien Hirst, people like famous artists to design tombstones, and then people could buy them. And so when they got buried, they'd be buried under a Grayson Perry or buried under a Damien Hirst. I thought it was a really good idea. And I approached the guy that used to run the Frieze Art Fair, Matthew Slotover. I said, look, this is a really great idea. We'll go halves on this. I mean, I would love to be buried under a famous artwork. Yeah. But he wasn't interested. I think he was more interested in the future as being more positive than that. So no, that never happened. I had no idea
about this. We should resuscitate this idea. And we'll get our listeners to sign up. They can help us launch this new venture. So bright days ahead, Weld.
Oh, hang on. Waldy and Bendy's route to death. I mean, yes, we could make a pile of money. Oh, dear. But of course, so much art is commemorative, isn't it? And just going back to our serious discussion of Iran again. So Isfahan, the great city of Isfahan, which of course was one of the places they're bombing because they said that a lot of the nuclear research in Iran was taking place near Isfahan. But again, it's one of the most gorgeous cities you could ever go to. I mean, let's just pray and hope and get down on our knees and beg that one day these things will be sorted out and we can all go and visit the beautiful art of Persia again, and that it isn't in too bad a state for us to enjoy it. But Isfahan has these amazing tombs, and what really got me was I went to this place called the Chehel Sutun Palace, which was built by the greatest of I think they were the Safavids. There's the terrible thing about Islamic art is that you have to learn all these dynasties. So there's so many dynasties ruling one after the other. And in Iran or Persia, there were so many, the Parthians, the Sasanians, the Seljuks, and the biggest of them all were the Safavids, I think. And the Safavids were the ones that had Shah Abbas the Great as their most famous leader. And so he builds this palace, the Chehel Sutun Palace. And do you know what it's full of?
Rock crystal, gold, fabrics?
No. Paintings.
Oh, right.
Of dancing girls, of people having fun, of musicians playing various musical instruments, of topless dancers, men and women, and stuff you would never, ever in a million years these days expect to find in an Islamic monument. But of course, Persian art wasn't like that. I mean, the trouble with a lot of Islamic art, I think, is that we've got an image of it now that's been seen through the lens of what's happened recently, the Wahhabi strain of Sunni Islam. Well, the early Shia art that you see in Iran just didn't have those sorts of prescriptions. And even the prescription against making images that you see nowadays being followed so fervently, that just didn't exist. So people painted these glorious images, and they were images of paradise. They were envisionings of a wonderful future that people can have if they lead a good life and listened properly to the Prophet Muhammad's teachings. They were glorious, absolutely glorious. And you probably know the kind of style they're in because Persian miniatures continue to fascinate us today, don't they? They're such beautiful artworks.
Yeah.
So it was just an absolute joy to see all this stuff. It was an absolute argument against people's ideas of what Islamic art should be. Historically, traditionally, in the past, Islamic art was celebratory, positive and glorious, and Iran is packed with proof of that. So please have a look at my little bit of film, listeners and viewers, if you get a chance. At least you'll get a slight flavour of that. But Bendy, I know that this, of course, I'm yet another, as it were, fascinated European who's ended up there, and I'm certainly one of many, aren't I?
Undoubtedly, Wild, and let us hope that this is all over very soon, because I would like to come on the Waldy tour of great Persian art, and we can go to all these places. And we can not only admire the great history of Persian art, but we can make some notes for our Mausoleum business venture as well. So that's all very exciting. But well, there's so much I could say about the influence of Persian art coming back in the other direction towards Europe. But I just wanted to focus on a couple of moments, if that's all right with you. Oddly enough, there's a long time when not much Persian art and culture managed to get through to Europe. There's all sorts of reasons for that, but just a little glimpse of how that manifests itself. I want to show you a sheet of drawings by Peter Paul Rubens. These are in the British Museum in his so-called costume book, and there's wonderful, very quickly drawn Rubens drawings of men and women in all sorts of glorious Persian costumes and their various weapons, and it all looks very reportagey. But actually, we know that Rubens had not seen Persian people, and he was copying some of the Persian miniatures that you were discussing. And one of the key moments when a lot more Persian art and culture and artifacts comes into Europe is, in fact, when the British and the Persians retake together the port of Hormuz, which is where so much geopolitical uncertainty and action is happening today. And that helps re-establish a kind of a trade route for Persian influences to come the other way. And, well, here we are. I'm always going to try and smuggle in an instance of Sir Anthony Van Dyck, and I want to show you Van Dyck's wonderful portraits of the Shirleys. Do you know these? They're in Petworth House.
I guess I've seen them. I don't remember them very clearly. It's Mr. and Mrs. Shirley, isn't it? Done up as Persians.
That's right. It's Sir Robert Shirley, who was ambassador to, you mentioned him earlier, the great Shah Abbas in the Safavid era. And he comes back. It's not Mrs. Shirley, not Lady Shirley, that was her name, but actually he married and fell in love when he was in Persia with a Circassian lady. So she is called, her name was Teresa Sampsonia. And in these double portraits by Van Dyck, which were actually painted in Italy when Sir Robert Shirley and his wife come back from their ambassadorship, you see them wearing these extraordinary Persian fabrics. And Van Dyck, of course, the son of a draper himself, had a wonderful eye for painting a beautiful gold fabric. And these are the kind of fabrics which he's glorying in, which come into Europe and have quite a dramatic impact on taste and fashion from a fabric point of view.
I've got it up in front of me now, the portrait of Lady Shirley. And, oh, God, it's a glorious thing, isn't it? I mean, funny enough, she doesn't look Persian, does she? Or she looks as if she could just be an English noblewoman, but that's the glory of her clothes is what really overwhelms the picture, isn't it? I mean, Van Dyck was such a great painter of clothes. It's second only to Veronese, I think, when it comes to painting cloth. Absolutely glittering, shiny, beautiful. What an amazing picture. I mean, imagine you're stuck in 17th century boring Europe full of Flemish Protestants, and suddenly somebody comes along with this stuff from the East. From Persia, massive, great reams of silk and glorious, glistening golden fabrics. I mean, it must have just felt so exciting.
Yeah, and as you say, the Persian fabric that Sir Robert Shirley is wearing is extremely figurative. There's depictions of females on there, so it's a real glimpse into that world, and what a shock it must have been. But these trends continue, Wild, as connections built up between Europe and the Persian Empire. And I want to take you to a moment, I have to admit, this is illustrated by a far less talented artist. I mean, it's a good painter, but it's a painting by Antoine Coypel, painted in 1715, and this represents the moment when a Persian ambassador, who was called Muhammad Reza Beg, comes to the court of Louis XIV himself, the Sun King in France, in 1715. And he goes to Versailles, and this extraordinary scene happens when the Persian ambassador is presented to Louis XIV. And as you can see in the painting, it happens in the Hall of Mirrors, where so many dramatic moments in French history take place. And we see in the painting the ambassador and all his attendants. They are approaching Louis XV, who we know from records was so keen to impress the Persian ambassador that he put on his most diamond-studded jacket possible. And it was so studded in diamonds that he couldn't actually then go and have the various meals and ceremonies afterwards in that diamond jacket because it was impossible to move around. So he had to change. And so we see this moment in the painting. And this is a painting which celebrates those meetings of those two empires. Now, I think it's really interesting to stress here that for Louis XIV, one of the reasons why the French monarchy is putting so much effort into being nice to the Persian ambassador, not only was there trade deals to be done, but for the French, the Persian Empire was represented a real sort of a shining beacon of slightly exotic brilliance. So if imagine you're in France and you're looking and you want to look east, right? To see a little bit of Orientalism, a little bit of exotic strangeness and other exciting artistic, cultural impacts coming to Europe, then the first place you would look is the Ottoman Empire, which for obvious historical reasons is something they are often afraid of. This was an empire which had come up and taken over the Byzantine Empire and was threatening quite often at Europe's door.
Well, invading Europe. I mean, right to the doors of Poland.
Right, indeed.
Battle of Vienna, yeah.
Where the Poles saved the day. What was the fellow? Sobieski.
That's it, yeah. Sobieski. Well done, Bendy.
Now, on the other hand, China was a little bit too far away and too mysterious. But Persia was the kind of sweet spot. So it was an ancient monarchy. It was exotic. It was philosophical. It was full of, as we mentioned, great art and poetry and all these exciting things. So that's why in this glorious painting in Versailles, you see so much effort being made into welcoming the Persian ambassador. And there are so many artistic impacts, little lightning bolts that I could show you to illustrate the significance of this moment. I'll just focus on one, for example. So Watteau, the great French Rococo artist, he does a series of lovely drawing studies of the Persians in their wonderful costume. You can see those. There's one in the V&A, one in the Morgan Library. But Wilde, I want to actually end, if I may, by making a slight historical leap here. Because not only was the cultural and artistic impact of this Persian embassy in 1715 quite significant, but it had a more philosophical and political impact. And here I want to talk about Montesquieu. Do you know what I mean by Montesquieu?
I know who you mean, but what that's got to do with Persia, I have no idea.
Well,
essayist, Montesquieu.
Yes, the Enlightenment philosopher, judge, who eventually his writings, particularly his book, The Spirit of the Law, or in French, L'Esprit des Lois, which was published in 1748, which eventually had a huge impact on the formation of the American Constitution, and in particular, the concept of the separation of powers. So we'll come on to that, but that's all Montesquieu's doing, okay? Hold that thought. Now, Montesquieu is one of the people who's in Paris when the Persians are here. And the Persians create such a stir, everybody's fascinated by them, and people go a little bit Persian mad for a moment. And Montesquieu has this idea of trying to understand what it must have been like for the Persians coming to Paris and seeing everybody fascinated with them and finding their ways strange and curious. And so he writes this very important and satirical book called The Letters of the Persians, right, which was published in 1722. And many people say that this book was one of the first really foundational texts of the Enlightenment. And what Montesquieu does is he uses the eyes of the Persians in France to almost like hold a mirror up to the French themselves. Because the French viewed the Persians as this great civilization, it allowed Montesquieu to safely critique some of the stranger things about French society and French government. So everything from the monarchy, the Catholic Church, the way Parliament did or did not work, he's able to criticize those by writing these fictional letters from the Persians back home who were saying, goodness me, the French society and the French monarchy, they do all these strange and curious things. And so his book became a bestseller. And it's from that book that eventually he goes on his journey. And the Enlightenment, of course, is that moment where people in Europe start to question all their inherited systems and beliefs. And eventually he comes up with his Spirit of the Law, the book, The Spirit of the Law. And in that book, he thrashes out his theory that you should have a separation of powers. So in an American constitution, this ends up with the legislature, the executive, that's the presidency, and the courts. And he says this is the ultimate rule against despotism. And the American founding fathers take this to heart. So the point is, Wald, you can draw a line between the arrival of the Persians in Paris in 1715 and the formation of the American Constitution, which is set up in such a way, Wald, as to ensure, in theory, that an overmighty executive cannot do things like launch wars or lock people up without the balances of various other aspects of the government. How about that?
I've enjoyed following your very, very, very wiggly line from the Persians to the separation of the executive and the legislature, etc. We're obviously in a situation where those triumphant constitutional decisions are being played with somewhat unfortunately. I think that's true to say. But wow, yeah. So is there art involved in this? Did someone paint Montesquieu being Persian, or what's the artistic end here?
No, alas, that would be lovely, wouldn't it? If there was some great portrait of Montesquieu dressed in Persian dress and having Persian coffee. No, such a thing doesn't exist, unfortunately.
And of course, Jefferson spent a lot of time in Paris, didn't he? So he would have loved reading all that. And so much of the White House, the Capitol building, all that is kind of pure neoclassicism, isn't it? Which would have been encountered in Europe at the time. How very interesting. Listen, Bendy, let's all hope. Let's cross our fingers. Everything you say has just made me want to go back to Iran even more and see and rediscover and revisit those wonderful moments we had there. Let's hope that this situation is resolved relatively painlessly without too much destruction, that the art survives. It's sad times we live in. I suppose the only real positive is that art can sometimes make use of these events and turn terrible events into interesting things. We saw last week, didn't we, on the podcast, how Mohammed Sami survived the fall of Saddam Hussein and the Iraq War, and the results are some of the finest and most important paintings of recent times. So who knows, maybe some good will come out of it. But I doubt it. Anyway, listen, enough of this darkness, of this hopelessness. Let's cheer ourselves up a bit. So I think we should look at something that's popped up recently on the telly, which I think leads us into some of art's deepest secrets. Art's deepest secrets. So, Bendy, I was watching TV the other day. Who should pop up? It's a Sunday morning, but our former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And he was being interviewed on a news programme by Laura Kuenssberg, who's a famous sort of British journalist, about the Ukraine situation. This was before Iran blew up, so we were still unaware of what's going to happen there. And I have to say, he looked absolutely awful, Bendy. I mean, it's not up to me to point out how bad people's haircuts are, because I've got a particularly awful one myself. As you know, the Waldy Mount Fuji cut is much mocked wherever people get a chance to mock art critics. But Boris Johnson's haircut was absolutely ridiculous. And it isn't just me saying this. Everybody who's watched it and who wrote in said, what on earth has happened to him? I mean, he looked like a scarecrow, had been standing in a field and had pigeons going through his hair and crows crapping on him. He looked absolutely awful. And it reminded me of something, and I suddenly realised what was going on here, because
Wurzel Gummidge,
but worse Wurzel Gummidge, yeah. But Bendy, listen to this, right?
Sorry, for international listeners, Wurzel Gummidge was a character from children's TV back in our day, or certainly back in my day. He was a scarecrow out in the field who came to life, and he had straw for hair, and he looked like Boris Johnson, or Boris Johnson looked like him. Sorry,
he did.
Explainer.
He did. Okay, so Boris Johnson. And we'll have pictures up so that people can see how awful he looked on the telly the other day, and this ridiculous hairstyle of his. And of course, our American friends will have some knowledge already of mighty rulers with bad haircuts. No names mentioned, of course. But anyway, Boris Johnson pops up, and I've met him Well, I've been in the same room as him only once in my life, right? And do you know where that was?
Was he offering you a knighthood? One of the many occasions you turned it down.
No, Bendor. As I have told you on many an occasion, indeed, I am not interested in knighthoods, and you will become Lord Bendor of Grosvenor long before I get any gongs. Hurrah. But I did meet him. I met him in New York, right? Mm-hmm. And I was going round the Andy Warhol exhibition at the Whitney Museum of Art in New York, right? So this was 2018, right? There was a big exhibition devoted to Andy Warhol. And it was a fabulous show. I really enjoyed it. But suddenly I hear this voice, and it was Boris, right, going around, I think, with family or something. And he walked into this room, right? One of Warhol's many series of lithographs and screen prints. It was called The Most Wanted Men. And it was basically loads of mugshots of people who'd done terrible things and were being hunted all over America with his poster saying, Most Wanted. And so I managed to take a photo of Boris Johnson surrounded by these posters saying the most wanted man, right? So that was good fun. But more importantly, then there was a room full of Andy Warhol self-portraits. Now, you know what Andy Warhol looked like, don't you?
Well, he wore a wig, didn't he? A sort of
wore not just a wig. It was a Wurzel Gummidge style shock wig. Right, and I've met Warhol a few times, actually, and he was always wearing these crazy wigs that stuck out from his hair at weird angles. And I suddenly realised that Boris Johnson must have borrowed his hairstyle from Andy Warhol. Because the show was full of Andy Warhol portraits where he's got this crazy uncut hair sticking out of his head. And Boris was there, which is already unusual, isn't it? What the hell's he doing in an Andy Warhol show? And then when I took the photograph of him and put it next to a Warhol self-portrait with the shocking hair, it was absolutely the same thing. It was déjà vu. So I'm proposing on the Waldy and Bendy podcast the revolutionary idea that Boris Johnson stole his haircut from Andy Warhol. What do you say to that?
I think that is a far more plausible and less tortuously explained art historical link than my one from the Persian embassy to the American Constitution. So well done, Well. But hang on, we cannot let this slide by for dear listeners. There you are, just dropping into the conversation casually that you've met Andy Warhol a few times. Can you tell us what he was like in person? Was the wig really obviously bad, or did he just style it out?
I met him a few times, yes, at openings. There used to be a gallery called the Anthony Doffey Gallery in London, and Doffey represented Warhol towards the end of Andy's life. He came to a show once. I think it was of his self-portraits. I think they were the piss portraits, they were called, where he would made self-portraits by urinating on screen prints. So there was a kind of green tinge to them, and they looked a little bit as if history had kind of aged them prematurely. But it involved that image of him, the famous image of him with the big hair and the small face. But yeah, he was there. And I interviewed him and, in fact, went for a kind of drink with him where he had a glass of water and I had a drink. But what I remember, two things about it. One was when the opening happened, Warhol was standing behind this glass table, right? He was behind a glass table, protected from the zillions of people who were there. I mean, everybody was trying to get near him. So the whole gallery was full of this mob, this horde of leaning art lovers. And they pushed forward so strongly, the table broke in the middle. So this glass table collapsed in front of Andy Warhol, and suddenly this baying mob was like that far away from him. So that was scary. But the thing I remember about him most was, I met him. I said, "Hello, Mr. Warhol. I'm Waldemar Nuszczak of the Sunday Times," and I shook his hand. Mm-hmm. He had the limpest handshake of anybody I've ever touched. So some people have a limp handshake. I have quite a firm one, but some people have a limp. This was beyond limp. This was.
I believe you've shaken the hand of the Queen, Wald. Am I right in that?
I have shaken the hand of the Queen. The Queen's handshake was firmer than Andy Warhol's.
Oh
this was like a piece of blancmange hanging off a wrist, and when you picked it up, it had no resistance whatsoever. So you pushed it up and down, and there was you were doing all the work, and it was all about that. It was all about making you do everything while this kind of vacuum allowed you to as it were, pour into it and meet Andy. So I just remember the handshake. It was so spooky.
But what about the wig, though? Was it a really bad wig, as bad as it looks in the photos?
It was a big wig. Very big, it covered up most of his face. I mean, it was such a big wig, such a load of hair, that you only saw a little bit of his face poking out underneath, which I think is what he liked about it, because it meant that whatever else was going on in his head, his face at the time wasn't visible. So it was also a way of hiding. People always hide behind big hair. That's what they do. You often see nervous people twiddling with their hair or growing big beards and having floppy fringes. It's to hide behind it, isn't it? So there's a sort of, Freud would have loved it. So yeah, very, very big wig. I didn't think at the time this reminds me of Boris Johnson, but I do think that now.
Okay. Well, okay. Any more art historical links you can tease out of this this deep thesis?
Well, this got me onto this idea that we should be dealing with haircuts in art, right? And particularly, I like the idea of bad haircuts because, as I said, I've got a particularly good bad haircut myself. I'm well known for the Mount Fuji, the haircut based on Japan's great national volcano.
Yeah, which I aspire to, of course, but I haven't got the means to enact.
Well, you've got
sadly.
you've got one of those foreheads that just demands exposure, and you're giving it a chance to be as intelligent looking as it is. But I don't know about you, but I remember certain bad haircuts from art. I have that cheap sort of mind. When I go around a museum, I remember, and almost all of the really bad ones I've seen have been Flemish. Flemish art of the 15th century. It just seemed to specialise in the awful haircut. Now, I don't know if you've noticed that as well, but painters such as Roger van der Weyden, Hans Memling, even Van Eyck, they loved to paint people looking terrible. So, you've heard of Robert Campan, of course, the great Flemish precursor of so much. I mean, more or less contemporary with Van Eyck. So you're talking about the early 1500s. So Robert Campan painted this picture. It's a portrait that's in the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid. And it's supposedly of a sort of fat fellow called Robert de Mamim. Viewers can catch up on it on the website and on the ZCZ channel. And it's a ridiculous look. It's just ridiculous. And this guy's got a puffy face like mine, big, big cheeks. And of course, Campan, as this brilliant precursor of Flemish realism, has done a marvellous job on showing the 5 o'clock shadow, the wrinkles under his eyes, the small ears, and he even captures the way the hair kind of is starting to grow at the sides because the haircut was a few days ago or whatever. But on top of it all, he's got, I think it's called a bowl cut. And this was the favourite Flemish haircut of the time. Do you know the bowl cut? Do you know what that is?
I do indeed, yes. We used to have them at my prep school. Saved a lot of time.
So are there pictures of you with the bowl cut, Bendy? Because I want to see them.
Do you know what? I hate having my hair cut. It's like my number one phobia. The only good thing about COVID, as far as I was concerned, was that I didn't have to have my hair cut for about 2 years, as far as it felt. So it all goes back to those traumatic days, yes.
Are there photos of you with a bowl cut?
Probably somewhere, but I'm sure they're happily lost, so we can't inflict them on the listeners.
Oh, so do you know what? We have a shared school haircut story then, because I was expelled from my boarding school.
Oh.
And do you know why I was expelled?
Let me get a punk rocker hairstyle.
Well, not really, no. But it was a Polish Catholic boarding school, and we used to have these haircuts every 2 weeks. And the guy that used to come and do our hair was a lay brother at the boarding school. So he wasn't a proper priest yet. He was one of these sort of lay figures. He was also the guy that worked on the farm at the school. So he used to shear the sheep with this shearing device. Every year he'd shear the sheep, and then twice a week he'd come around and do us. And so it hurt like hell. This machine used to basically pull the hair out of the back of your neck. It was absolute torture. And I ended up, after 5 years at this school, I ended up hating it so much. So one day I persuaded this poor guy who'd arrived at the school quite recently, he was a new boy, that we should somehow try and take out the electricity in one of the school classrooms so that the guy couldn't plug in his electric shears and do our haircuts. So we did that thing, you get a metal compass, and you put it into a plug, and you turn the switch on, and it short circuits the circuit, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So we tried to do it just to the classroom we were in, but it ended up blowing up the whole school electricity circuit.
The whole town.
So huge problems. And I'm afraid both of us were expelled, including this poor boy who'd only just arrived in the school, who'd been talked into it by me.
Wow.
Tragic. Nothing to do with art, though, so let's move on quickly.
Okay.
But they're awful haircuts. So, yeah, Flemish haircuts, Bendy. I'll quickly get on. They are awful. There's several. There's also a good one by another great painter of the Flemish era, Petrus Christus, whose work I love, called Portrait of a Carthusian. That's in the Metropolitan in New York. He's got a bowl haircut, but he's also got a great kind of ZZ Top beard to go with it. So there's this forked beard plus the bowl haircut. I mean, it's not a good look in my opinion, in my humble opinion. But I wanted to just focus quickly on what I think is the worst example of a haircut in Flemish art, which is in a great painting by Van Eyck that's in the Louvre. It's the Madonna of Chancellor Roland. Now, Chancellor Roland was this heroic chancellor of the Dukes of Burgundy, important figure. When he was 60, apparently, he commissioned this painting. So there's the Madonna and Jesus. They're being crowned and they're being presented to Chancellor Roland, who's kneeling in front of them. He's got his hands folded in prayer. There's a beautiful view through the window of the landscape, probably the lands that he owned. There's a river and there's a couple of little figures looking on. It's a fantastic and beautiful piece of Flemish realism. But unfortunately, it's such a good piece of Flemish realism that it really shows off Chancellor Roland's appalling hairstyle. So he has two tragic things going on here. Have a look at it, Bendy, and all our viewers as well and listeners on the ZTZ podcast YouTube pages. Have a look at him there carefully. Two tragic things about him. One, the haircut is a particularly bad bowl haircut. We didn't explain fully what a bowl haircut is. Basically, it did consist of putting a bowl on your head and then cutting off all the bits that were poking out round the rim. So essentially, it was a very simple way to cut your hair. So you basically cut off everything underneath the bowl, take the bowl away, and what's left is the rest of the haircut. Yeah. So he's got the bowl haircut. That's tragic. But then look at his face, Bento. Look at his face. Doesn't he look like Vladimir Putin? I mean, spitting image I'm talking here.
He does a bit.
Not a bit, a lot.
I sympathise with him because he looks like the man who just can't be bothered to go to the hairdresser, and he's gone to the local barber on the high street and he's come out having dropped only £5 and he's delighted. And that's how I like to have my hair cut done too.
Oh, well, there you go.
No chit-chat. No worrying about fashions, no worrying about Mount Fuji little quiffs at the top. Oh. None of that. Bosh, in and out.
That's below the belt. So listen, I think it's a particularly bad haircut. I think it was just exactly like Vladimir Putin. And it's a beautiful painting by Van Eyck, but it's ruined by the haircut. I'm going to leave off in just one more thing, one more example. That's right. And this is a painting that's in Montreal, in the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal. And it's by Hans Memling, pupil of Roger van der Weyden. And it's just a portrait of a young man, right? But I'll never see it. Right, can you see that? I mean, that's a ridiculous hairstyle, isn't it? That's also Flemish, more or less of the same period. I think it's probably school of Memling rather than Memling himself, but you can't hide from that haircut. It's got long hair this time, falling all over the place, but it just makes him look silly, doesn't it? I mean, what is it about the Flemish and their taste for awful haircuts?
Well, he would look very good in the 1970s. That's sort of disco fever haircut, isn't it?
Disco. Yes, he looks like the lead singer of Sweet. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Put me out of my misery. So I've been banging on about bad haircuts. I mean, where are you going to take us with this? I mean, you're an expert on the good and the bad haircut.
Well, it's just interesting how quickly they date things and how easy they make it to identify a period or moment in art. In fact, one of the things that's always the giveaway when you watch, say, for example, an old film or when they're doing yet another interpretation of Jane Austen's Pride or Prejudice. They look quite current when you watch it, but they date so quickly because of the hairstyle, don't they? So if you watch a Pride and Prejudice that was made in the 90s or the 80s, you think, oh my God, they've got the costumes and the fashion and the hair all wrong. Nobody looked like that in the 18th century. But it's harder for us to be that removed from it when we're in the moment ourselves. But you know what? Because I sympathise with people struggling with hair issues, I wanted, by contrast, to talk about what I think is the best haircut in art. Would you let me do that?
I will let you do anything, Bendy. You know that. Well, but it's against the thrust of the conversation. But it sounds like we could end on something more positive. So yeah, go ahead. Best haircut in art.
Well, it only just edges yours into second place. Well, but this is Albrecht Dürer's self-portrait in Munich, in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. And it's the self-portrait that's dated 1500. And I'm sure listeners will easily be able to bring it to mind. It's the one where he's looking straight at us. It's half length, and he's got his hand up by his chest, one hand only. And he's got the most magnificent array of long, beautifully curled little ringlets, and they're parted in the middle, and they're coming down over his shoulder. Lovely auburn chestnut hair, and there's so much L'Oreal bounce in those curls. Well, it looks like he's spent absolutely all week in the hairdressers. Don't you think that is the most beautiful bounce ever painted?
It's great painting of hair, and there is an awful lot of it, of course. I mean, the elephant in the room with that famous and great portrait by Dürer, the self-portrait, is the resemblance he bears to a certain well-known historical religious figure, right?
Yeah, well, Jesus Christ. There he is. And I think we can really push the hair thesis in the history of art here, because, as you say, it's the hair which makes us think, oh, that's Jesus. So the question is, where does the Jesus hairstyle come from? Because, well, as I think we've discussed on the podcast before, and we should do a deep dive on the image of Christ in art. But the very first images of him, he has no beard and he has short hair. And this is the moment when, obviously, the early Christians were trying to make inroads into the Roman Empire. And for a time, they thought it was more appropriate that Jesus looked like a Roman. And Romans...
But in fact, he looked like Apollo, didn't he? He had blonde, curly hair and a sweet Apollonian face. I mean, look, nothing like the Jesus we think of today.
Yeah. So that is that, as you say, there's the Apollo model, and the style favoured by high-class Romans was for short hair and no beards. So the really interesting moment changes after Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. There you get this sort of gradual tension where it seems to be more convenient and more desirable for Christ to be more convincingly not Roman. So he comes from Judea, obviously, and there's this idea that he has to begin to look a little bit different. And various things come into play to stress that, the most important of which is that his hair gets longer. And that is what we see ultimately reflected in Albrecht Dürer's self-portrait. The long hair is quite interesting how it emerges. There's various theories as to why the long hair comes. Some say the image is miraculously ordained, and you get this. There's things called I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but there's this idea of is it the Mandylion? This is the basically people imagine the shroud of
Veronica's veil.
Yeah. So the idea that the image of Christ is miraculously imprinted into various objects, the most famous of which is the Shroud of Turin, and there he's got long hair. So the combination of trying to make Christ look less like Apollo and these apparently miraculous images which begin to come into circulation around about the kind of, 7th, 8th, 9th century, these two things combine to set in stone the idea that Christ has long hair, and the beard is a part of that.
And of course, it was also influenced by Byzantine emperor portraits. So the Byzantine emperor would be sitting there with longer hair and a beard. Beard was very important. That was a Middle Eastern thing. And he would be sitting there looking very kind of front on and very frontal in his throne. So that kind of frontal image of Jesus. In fact, that sort of preceded the Jesus on a cross, which was the sort of almost the last incarnation of the Jesus image, wasn't it? Because nobody wanted to worship some guy who'd been hung and murdered and killed and bled on a cross. That didn't seem divine enough until you got into the Middle Ages, or at least later into the story, when it became possible to read that in more positive ways. Sorry, I interrupted you, but yeah.
No, really important point. But I do want to end the thesis on Dürer's self-portrait with do you know the Letter of Lentulus? This was an apocryphal document that was began to circulate in the later medieval period, and Lentulus was said to be a Roman soldier who had seen Christ and gave us this first-hand description of him. Because, of course, there's no description of what Christ looked like in the Gospels. And various people wanted to formulate this supposedly first-hand evidence of what Christ looked like. And the letter of Lentulus was first printed, Wild, in Germany in the late 15th century. And this is exactly where Albrecht Dürer is hanging around. So one of the first places it's printed, in fact, is Dürer's own Nuremberg. And if you have the image of the Dürer self-portrait in your mind, and I'm going to read you this little extract from the letter of Lentulus about Christ and see if you can see the similarities. Are you ready? His hair is the colour of the ripe hazelnut, straight down to the ears, but below the ears wavy and curled, with a bluish and bright reflection flowing over his shoulders. It is parted in two on the top of the head, after the pattern of the Nazarenes. His brow is smooth and very cheerful, with a face without a wrinkle or a spot. And his beard is abundant, the colour of his hair not long but divided at the chin. So there we are. That's it. Dürer must be reading that and going, I would like to present myself as Christ.
How interesting. But listen, why did he present himself as Christ? That's the
big question.
Yeah. It is the big question. What do you think? What's the answer?
Well, I was going to ask you first.
I wish I knew. I mean, obviously he was not an immodest man, and he often put himself into his pictures as a kind of witness, a star. I guess there must have been some sense in which he was presenting himself as a figure who'd been divinely inspired, I guess, who could paint as brilliantly as he could, because he was inspired, because he was some kind of mouthpiece of the gods. But perhaps also something going on here about God's creations being perfect. I mean, there was a lot of talk in the Renaissance about how God's world was perfect. Perhaps Dürer, by perfecting himself and getting out an image of himself that was sort of flawless in that way, may have been comparing himself as a sort of creation of Jesus, of the gods. I don't know. I mean, it's a mystery. No, if I knew, I would have written books about it. Nobody knows for sure.
The other really spooky thing about that letter of Lentulus is it ends by saying that his eyes are blue, grey and bright. And those are also Dürer's eyes in the painting.
And he changed his hair colour, didn't he? Because he was, and if you look at his other pictures, he's kind of blonde. So the earlier self-portraits of him, there's two, aren't there? There's one in the Louvre, one in the Prado. He's got much lighter hair.
Yeah.
So he would have changed his hair colour to look darker. So that's, as you say, he'd have gone on and used the L'Oreal and had his hair in the bath and tinted it or whatever.
Well, he clearly read the letter of Lentulus, and he clearly wants to present himself as looking like Christ. And I used to think that Dürer, and why not? One of the greatest artists who ever lived was thinking, goodness me, I'm sort of almost divine in the things that I create, so why don't I paint myself to look like Jesus? And then, I went to see the picture up close, and one of the extraordinary things you learn when you stand in front of it for some time is that from the photograph, it's easy to think that the gaze is looking directly at you. But in fact, if you stand in front of the picture, his gaze is ever so slightly averted. And I wonder if that is a kind of a conscious, he's just pulling it back at the last moment. He's presenting himself as Christ, but he's not being Christ. And I think it's a much less kind of boastful image than I'd first assumed. And of course,
or you were standing in the wrong place. That's also a possibility.
No, come on. The eyes follow you around the room, as they say. The cliche goes. No, it's really interesting. He's looking away. And of course, at the time, there's this perfectly acceptable idea that to live a Christly life, to live like Christ, you had to be as Christ-like as possible. So why not? Yeah. Imitatio
Christi or whatever it was. Yeah, that's right. I like his hand gesture. I'm really interested by these religious figures that have doing weird things with their fingers. And of course, Dürer, in quite a lot of his pictures, there's that great one about him, of Christ and the doctors in the temple, where the fingers are all twisted up, isn't there? And he's signalling something, isn't he, here?
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I've ever read about it is that he might be the initials A and D, sort of done with his fingers. Because that gesture that you see in a lot of religious art, that's Christ, who is both God and man. So he's both. Yeah. That's why they're doing a lot of Christ holding up the two fingers. And sometimes you get the three, because he's the members of the Trinity as well. So God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, plus he's God and man. So there's a sort of finger symbolism going on. And I'm sure there's something happening in this picture, but I don't know what it is. I'd love to investigate it, actually.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to wait for part 2 for we've done the hair, and then we'll have to come on to the hand another time.
Yeah. Oh, and lots of other artists, of course, have painted themselves as Christ. I mean, didn't your great hero Van Dyck, that resurrection of his, doesn't he give the resurrected Jesus Van Dyck-y features? For sure, Van Gogh did it in the Pietà, where he copied Delacroix's Pietà and he put his own face on the Christ. And Gauguin did it in his Agony in the Garden. So there are, there are other artists that have done this.
Yeah, I think Titian does it. Van Dyck used to turn himself more as a model for classical subjects like Paris and so on. But it does go on and on. We should explore this thesis more.
Oh, if only there was more time in life. We can't explore it now because we have to move on, Bendy. We've got our other lives to go back to. But it's been such fun talking to you. I feel, I mean, we've gone light at the end with our fun talk about haircuts, but let's not forget that actually we started out with a more serious thought about what's going on in Iran, and I want to leave everybody with a big hope that things will turn out and that people won't suffer and that art will survive. And on that, I hope, optimistic note, it's going to be goodbye from me.
Yes, and goodbye from me. See you next week.
Waldy and Bendy.